I'm Jennifer Baumbusch. I recognize most of you. It's nice to see all of you. Glad you all could make it. It's a special thrill for me to get to introduce Merrilee because she's always gets to introduce us.
That's great, yeah.
So Merrilee works in our Office of Research and Teaching Scholarship and is a very important resource within the School of Nursing to support around developing applications for funding, all sorts of funding. So we work very closely together. So I encourage you to remember her name and know that she can point you towards lots of helpful resources online in UBC and beyond, and treat her well. So there you go. And I'm interested to hear what you say. I also just wanted to say on the topic, I encourage you also to always come to these kinds of talks. I have come lots, and I go to lots, because even if you are well-funded, you always pick up new things. So next year, when we do this again, and Merrilee does this again, I really encourage you to come back. Maybe you'll have new questions, maybe you won't. But it's a really great opportunity to just think about how to best prepare yourself when you're applying for funding. So with that, I will turn it over to you.
So as Jennifer mentioned, I'm the grant facilitator in the School of Nursing, and I've been here for over 10 years now, which means I've actually got to see lots of changes over that time period. So again, if you think you've heard the message before, it is worth kind of reconnecting, because there's always new initiatives starting up, old ones morphing or changing. So it's a constantly kind of evolving framework. That said, I will also give the caveat that although I use a video game analogy for this talk, I don't play video games a lot. So if there's any real gamers in the audience, call me on my any faulty terminology I try to use here. So let's get going. So I'm going to start off with some general kind of principles to grant funding. And then speak a little bit more specifically into the nuts and bolts of actually applying for funding and how you might develop a strategy. And so as you can see, like I said, I'm using a bit of a video game analogy here, and that's not out of cynicism, and that like, oh, it's such a game to apply for these grants, but more that in playing games, it's really useful to have a strategy going into it, because these grant applications take a ton of time that you could spend doing research, writing papers, and so I think you have to be really strategic about what to invest your resources and the time of your supervisor and committee members and other references, because there's some competitions that may or may not be a good fit for you. So you don't want to waste time on competitions that aren't a good match. So to start off, I guess my first kind of principle of looking for grant funding is to choose your level. And so, here I pulled from a video game, whether you're a new recruit, whether you're a veteran, or whether you're a champion. And so I would say that in kind of the funding environment, the new recruit kind of levels can be quite often smaller grants. They might be a little bit of funding for some of your own thesis work. And they might be more at the university level or the local regional level. Once you get into the kind of veteran level, for example, a national student stipend, the money amount often increases, but so does the competition. And so I think thinking really carefully about who are the people that have been winning these awards in the past, and whether your own kind of skill level matches that sort of past recipient level. So it gives you a sense of how to kind of where you place relative to the funding competitions that you're looking at. And then, here I've said this champion level of funding is, say, large external research operating funding. And this is where a lot of our faculty are kind of functioning at, and this can be really an important thing to think about too in some of the next stages. So once you've figured out your level that you want to kind of compete at, I joke that you want to power up. And so this is about building your CV. And so again, you know, it sounds a bit cynical. Oh yeah, I got to do all these things so I can put them on my CV, but it's really kind of a scorecard that you can use to track all of the research skills that you're developing. So, you know, you might want to look at your publications, any grant funding that you've had previously. You might want to look at the awards that you've received, any grants that you've been able to be a co-investigator on, any reviews you've been able to do for student journals or other academic journals, research posters and presentations that you've been able to give. So not only is it really important to think strategically about how to build your CV, your academic CV, in terms of kind of collecting your research points and building your score, it's also important to think about how you describe what's in your academic CV, because so often reviewers aren't familiar with the area that you work in, and so they, you know, you might say, oh yeah, I got this award, knowing that this was a fantastic award, super hard to get. It really showed a high degree of achievement. But if the reviewer is not familiar with their field, they might just like, oh yeah, a nice little award, that's great. So I always talk about contextualizing your CV. So when you list an award, also find a way to include in some way what the significance of that award is. Was it, you know, out of thousands that you got this award? You know, if it has money attached, was it a substantial sum? If it doesn't have money attached, does it still have a lot of prestige in your field or your sub area? It's, I think, really important even at an early stage to start tracking some of these things, because this academic CV plays a big role in your funding applications. But then again, also to think about opportunities to engage in that might help add to that as well. So the next principle of grant funding I would describe as teaming up. And so this is, I guess, a few different ways. One is, you know, not only are funding applications looking at your CV, but they're looking at who you're working with. So your supervisor, so in terms of the kind of funding your supervisor gets, the kind of publications they have, in terms of their past trainees and students that they've mentored. So you need to think strategically about who you're aligning yourself with in terms of your research team, even if it's an informal team, because it will help leverage you in terms of your own research trajectory. And that can happen both in formal ways and informal ways. So like I said, with a supervisor, you might want to strategically think about people who are really dynamic in their field and are highly recognized in an area. But you might also want to think about kind of some of the networking that you want to do, because sometimes there's opportunities to engage in side projects as a co-investigator or as a co-author on another paper. And those are all things that build your research experience, and again, go on that kind of scorecard in terms of your academic CV. So even though we haven't even got to talking about the actual grant funding yet, these are all things that are going to be really important in terms of your kind of profile when you apply for grant funding. So my next principle is read up. So I have a large sample grant library within the school, and this is collected over years from very generous students and academics who've kindly agreed to share successful applications. So quite often I can't send them out, but I have hard copies in office, and I'm always surprised at how few people actually come and read them, because there's nothing like reading successful grants to really get a sense of what makes a fundable application. So, you know, we have these sample grants for some of our internal awards. We have some for some of the federal awards. If there's something you're thinking about applying for, always feel free to send me a little note and say, hey, do you know anybody in the school that's already been down this road? Is there a successful application on file that I might be able to look at? Sometimes it's also the sort of informal word on the street that I hear too, right? So whether or not we have a hard copy application for you to look at, sometimes I've talked to faculty, for example, who've sat on the review panels for some of these competitions. So I might not be able to give you a sample grant, but I may be able to say, oh, these are what I've heard from some of our reviewers that sit on these committees. This is sort of the bar that needs to be met. This is, in spite of what it says on the website, this might be a priority for this funding competition. So again, it's always really helpful to do this kind of due diligence in reading up in terms of the actual funding application requirements, but also potential sample grants and what their past history of funding. So quite often funding agencies post who's been recipients of their past grants. So again, to have a look at who's getting those past grants, what kind of areas they're working in, and what kind of caliber academics they are themselves. And then write up. There's nothing like actually writing grants to get better at writing grants. So, you know, although I cautioned at the beginning, don't spend a ton of time writing to everything under the sun if it's a competition that you might not be competitive in. That said, the only way to get better at writing grants is to practice writing grants. So be strategic in choosing the grants that you might want to apply for, but then give yourself enough time to really work on developing a strong proposal. So, you know, these are just some really kind of generic recommendations, but I actually think they hold true across lots of different competitions, because when you think about reviewers reviewing grants, they read so many. So anything you can do to make their job easier in terms of understanding what your research is about, and being really clear and confident in what you're claiming that you want to do for your project and what your kind of capacity to achieve those activities is in terms of your team and resources that you have access to. And you know, it sounds like a no-brainer, but all the time I see these grants that are just so filled with acronyms that even people familiar with the field are starting to scratch their head. So always be cautious of that. It's a very common kind of pitfall for all of our kind of junior and senior grant writers, and to use all the space provided. There's nothing so aggravating for reviewers as having lots of questions about your proposal and seeing that there was still an extra page that you didn't use. I think they're more forgiving if there's some uncertainties, if you've maximized your space allowance, but if there's unused space and you don't answer all their questions, that tends to be bad news. So those are some generic principles, but I want to talk a little bit more specifically about actually finding the money. So there's lots of guides at UBC, myself included, who spend a lot of time trying to hunt down different funding opportunities. So we have our student services office that sends out a weekly graduate e-newsletter. Has anybody received those already? A few of you. If you haven't, you should be added to the list very, very shortly. So I'll remind student services that they need to update their lists as soon as possible. There's also a monthly e-newsletter that comes out from my office, so it's not specific to students, but it's specific to the School of Nursing, and it also includes graduate funding listings, abstract deadlines, conference submission deadlines. So again, those are nice kind of ongoing aggregators of dates and deadlines and funding opportunities that you'll want to monitor. And then the UBC Faculty of Graduate Studies and Postdoctoral Fellowship Awards also does a regular thing. So I don't know, have all of you looked at their website? They actually have a database that they you know, have a lot of staff time dedicated to updating and maintaining. So in some ways, these are excellent resources to help you stay on top of kind of opportunities that are emerging and developing. But oh yeah, and I find too, like I joke that I spend all my time subscribing to lists, and so I am constantly replenishing inbox. But you know, it's hard sometimes to remember to go recheck different websites every 3 weeks or something for updates. But if you're on their newsletters and their feeds, and it's actually, you know, it cues you to new things that comes out. And then if there's any early announcement of funding opportunities, then you're definitely on the kind of leading edge of learning about those. So make sure you look at the kind of funding sources and websites that you are already regularly visiting and see if you can actually apply for their newsletters as well. So the next one I'm thinking about too, in terms of identifying funding opportunities, is for you to really think about your own roles and what kind of affiliations that you have. So many of our students have clinical ties. They might have professional organization ties. Obviously, you have student ties to the UBC, but you may have other student kind of connections. And all of these different organizations have quite often their own funding opportunities, and quite often ones that I would never know about, and even the UBC, say, Graduate Studies website might not know about. So I think recognizing that you actually have a network of your own and that you need to make sure that you're fully aware of the opportunities that are available to you through those professional ties of your own. And then, of course, to think about the field of study. And I should have said fields of study, because I would say so many of our students are working in cross-disciplinary and interdisciplinary areas. So when you really think about how your work connects to a lot of these different disciplines and kind of disease and condition and population areas, it would almost be a useful exercise to go through and kind of keyword list, brainstorm all the different topic areas, and then look strategically for who are the organizations, the nonprofit societies that are working in those areas, because quite often they're interested in building capacity in those areas. So again, it's about building your network in terms of becoming connected to the kind of organizations that support the type of work that you want to do with your research. So here's just an example. This is Canadian Nursing Foundation. Has anybody looked at this site before? So this one is nice. It's not huge amounts of money, but it has a really high success rate. So we've definitely had students have quite positive experiences with this funding agency. Their competition is annually kind of March 31st. So it's something to put on your calendar for next year to apply to. And don't put it in your calendar for March 31st, put it in your calendar for February so you can have time to develop that as well. And then here's just, this is more to make a point than to actually give you a list of links that you should go follow, but just that there's so many different professional and disease-specific organizations out there. And again, despite my best efforts to subscribe to everybody's newsletter, it's really important that you look at the organizations that are most relevant to your work and make sure that you find a way to stay connected to that organization in terms of funding opportunities that might be available to support the research that you do. And then just another kind of reminder that in addition to thinking about the types of research you do in terms of the areas and disciplines, there's also types of funding. And so these, I would say, are probably three key funding streams in research funding. The first one, very important to our students, is the salary kind of stipend award. And this is an award that gives you money that's basically salary in your pocket. Sometimes it comes with a small research allowance too, which gives you some funds for doing your research, but it's mainly a salary award to you, which means quite often that there's significant rules about what kind of work you can do in addition, because essentially they're saying we're going to give you money so that you can spend the bulk of your time doing research. So we'll talk a little bit more about those in a few minutes. There's also a project award, which is really about funding the cost of doing research. So if you need money for transcription, if you need money for stats programs, if you need money to provide honoraria for your research participants, that's the kind of funding that you might want to look at to help cover the costs of actually conducting your research. And then the last one is travel awards, and I'll mention a few of those as well. just in terms of attending conferences usually. And by attending conference, I actually mean presenting at conferences. I don't think I've ever seen really much in terms of funding just to attend conferences. It's always about presenting. So that's something to think about too in terms of building your CV. So in terms of stipends or the salary awards, there are a variety of different ways to do this, but some of the main ones are the Canadian Federal Tri-Council Awards. There's 3 Tri-Councils, but the 2 that most impact our students are the CIHR, which is the Canadian Institutes for Health Research, and SHRC, which is the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. They both have doctoral research awards, slightly different application process, which we can talk about another time, but these are the kind of premier student stipend award in Canada. So they're highly competitive. The expectation of students applying to this competition is at the doctoral level, you'll already have at least kind of 2 or 3 academic publications that you're first author on, that you would have already done some conference presentations. So substantial awards, they tend to be in the neighborhood of $30,000 a year, but highly competitive. So you'll want to talk to your supervisor about whether that's a good fit for you. My Tax Accelerate is another federal funding model. It's an interesting model in that it's really looking to leverage research connections between academia and the private sector. And they've actually expanded that to include the nonprofit sector. So if you are doing work that's highly engaged with nonprofit organizations or the health system, there are some really amazing opportunities with this MyTax funding program, in that the success rates are really high. So you have to do some of the legwork in terms of finding the partner and having them agree to participate in the program and provide some matching funding. But if you have a project that's going to really be of value or benefit to potential partner organizations, this can be a really fantastic way to leverage a salary type award. And quite often it comes with additional kind of development and capacity building in terms of workshops around project management, time management, etc. So there's some professional development opportunities through that can be quite good as well. Another one that I think sometimes people forget, but that many of our faculty members have project grants of their own. And so faculty can, in some cases, build in stipends or graduate research assistant salaries to help support their research trainees. So again, this isn't something that you can necessarily initiate yourself, but it's worth having a conversation with supervisors, particularly early on when you know they're applying for funding, to say, hey, is there some way that we can connect some of my doctoral work in with this larger funding project that you're looking for funding, to build in some salary for me as well. And kind of as a throwback to the CV building exercise, even if there isn't opportunities for you to get stipend off awards, sometimes there's opportunities for you to be a co-applicant on those awards. So again, a way for you to build experience and a bit of a track record in terms of being involved in these larger project grants. And then this last one, there used to be a lot of these kind of smaller topic-specific training area programs that came with funding. And that was as a result of kind of CIHR doing what they called STIR funding, which unfortunately they don't do anymore. But one of the, I think, legacies of that initial project is this one that still exists. It doesn't have much in the way of funding attached to it anymore, but it still has significant training. So if you are working in the area of primary healthcare, definitely something to look at, because it connects you to a national network working in this area, includes some travel funding to attend their training sessions across Canada, and like I said, lets you connect with other trainees in the area as well as academics across Canada. So their deadline's usually December 1st, so lots of time for that. They haven't posted their 2018 deadline yet, but I'm anticipating it will be the same. So I mentioned travel awards. These are just two kind of regular ones that I see. So again, it's worth keeping in mind if you're going to be presenting some of your work at a conference. UBC has one that you can only apply for once, and it's a fairly modest sum, but it's $500. So definitely worth applying to if you're planning on presenting at a conference. And again, it has the added bonus of being able to say that you've received funding to support your conference presentation. And CIHR, for example, also has them, depending on your topic area, that it can be anywhere from $1,000 to $2,500. Again, our graduate students have been very successful in this competition, and it comes, I think it's about twice a year now. It's changed over the years, but again, these deadlines get announced in the monthly newsletter quite regularly, and this one's a rolling deadline, so you can apply for it whenever you need to. So those are just two examples of travel awards to keep your eye on. And then this one's I just threw in here. I don't know if anybody's working in educational research, but I know quite often our master's students work in this area, and so just a reminder that there are sort of pots of money in different areas, and so this is one at UBC that's specifically focused on teaching and learning, and also requires there to be a strong student involvement in proposals. So if you are doing anything that has implications for nursing education, or even education in kind of larger student areas, something to keep in mind and then also to consider chatting about it with your supervisor in terms of what something like this might look like. And then this is one of our internal research grants at the School of Nursing. So these are a couple of the target areas, but essentially any student who has a nursing professor as their primary supervisor is eligible to apply for this competition. It's twice a year. The next deadline is November 5th, this fall. It's a fairly short application, so I think it's 5-page application, and it is project funding. So if you're doing work and you also have to have your proposal approved by this time, but it's definitely a really excellent funding source to help support the research activities that you're trying to do. And again, it has quite a high success rate, and you can also reapply if you don't get funding the first time. So now I want to just shift gears a little bit in terms of a game plan. Let's imagine that you've identified a funding source that you think might be a good fit. Of course, the very first thing I would say is talk with your supervisor about whether they think it's a good fit, and always happy to talk with students too in terms of my own experience with different funding competitions and who they fund and what their kind of funding competitiveness levels are, but then also to look really carefully at what the eligibility criteria are in terms of who can hold the kind of funding, what kind of projects they want to fund, and then deadlines as well in terms of internal deadlines, whether there's stages. Increasingly, we're seeing competitions that have either a letter of intent stage or kind of a registration stage before you submit a full application, which can be good because if your application is deemed not a good fit, then it saves you putting in a full application. So as you kind of work on your game plan for an application, some of the things that you'll want to keep in mind is the right reviewer criteria. And so this is something that's not always available, but often is, and that's actually the specific points that reviewers in the competition for that grant are required to use to evaluate your proposal. And so I always feel like this is kind of like looking behind the curtain in terms of really understanding how people will be evaluating your grant. And my first recommendation to people is print that criteria off and use it to evaluate your grant. And if you're having reviewers have a look at your proposal, whether it's your supervisor or some of your peers, to give them a copy of that too and say, hey, I would love to get your feedback from my proposal, and here's what the reviewer criteria is. Then in terms of developing a work plan, I always work backward from the submission deadline and any internal deadlines that may be required at UBC and School of Nursing. I would say on average it's about a week in advance of the actual deadline that you need to have a lot of the paperwork in for UBC requirements. But again, always happy to help confirm internal deadlines for students and faculty. Increasingly, I'm seeing funding applications come with checklists of their own, but if they don't have a checklist, or even if they do, make yourself your own checklist, because these applications often have so many little bits and pieces. You'd hate to ever be disqualified for missing some small piece. So work plan with kind of preliminary deadlines and timelines, and a checklist for your final application submission can be really key. So this is actually an example of the reviewer's guide from the School of Nursing's internal research grant competition. So again, just as an example, if you're writing a proposal for one of our internal research grants, have a look at what the reviewers are using to evaluate your grant. And I'm always so surprised when I see applications that have clearly missed some element of the application process when it was outlined specifically in the requirements for the application, but also on the publicly available reviewers guide. So again, always use those as criteria to evaluate your own application. And then again, kind of getting to sit behind the curtain in this example, I actually see what the reviewers frequently say for the internal research grants. So again, these are sort of the top feedback that I see in applications from our students to the internal research grant competition. And first and foremost, use all of the space, define your terms, concepts, acronyms. Even in the School of Nursing, everybody works in such diverse areas. Never expect that your reader will know what your obscure acronym is. Make sure that there's congruence between the research problem, questions, purpose, and design. Again, this is one that happens again and again in terms of reviewer feedback. And I don't know if it's a little bit of people piecing together old applications or changing some of their direction partway through the development of the proposal. But just be really clear that the proposal is kind of congruent across all the sections. And in this competition, it's important that there's a theoretical framework to your work. So again, this is perhaps unique to this competition, or an emphasis on this competition that maybe doesn't exist in every competition you might be applying to. But it's important to have a really clear conversation with your supervisor about what an appropriate theoretical framework for your work is. And then again, with methods, to really have a data analysis plan. Quite often it's lots of detail on how the data collection will happen, and then almost no detail on what will happen with that data once it's collected. So quite often see questions about the analysis. And then with the budget, and this is something, again, for any funding competition, to make sure that you stay within the eligibility requirements in terms of what's allowed to be funded in the competition, and then also within their funding caps. Because you never want the reviewers to have to fix your budget for you, because they tend not to be as generous if they're given a task. So just as kind of a final thing, kind of to go full circle in terms of the beginning, grants take a ton of time to develop, and the reality is funding success rates quite often are low. So you can write an amazing proposal that's actually a good fit for your funding competition and still not be funded. And so don't toss it, because you've already invested so much work in it. There's always ways to either rework it and resubmit it, or even retarget it towards a different funding opportunity. So again, I think it's always really important, even if you get a rejection notice from a funding competition you've submitted, to have that debrief conversation with your supervisor about, okay, what can we do next? How can I repurpose this work? Because so much time and energy is already being invested in the process, and you've got work that could be kind of reinvested in a new direction perhaps, or even just strengthened and resubmitted. So really, really important strategic conversation to have with your supervisors. And that's all I have in terms of my talk, but I'm happy to open it up. I don't know if Jennifer has some comments she wants to add, but I'm happy to take questions from anybody as well. And also always happy to be contacted. There's my telephone number, my email. If you have specific questions or requests around sample grants, yeah, always happy to chat with graduate students.
Thank you, thanks, Merrilee. So I think when I introduce myself, I may not have mentioned that I'm the PhD coordinator this year. So you may also have contact with me, and you're just as welcome to contact me anytime as Merrilee. I know you probably have a few questions. I just wanted to spit out my comments before I forget them based on that excellent presentation. I love the game analogy. That's very good. So these are not necessarily in any order, but it's sort of just in response to the different areas that Merrilee talked about. So one of the things is when you're applying for more like salary type or stipend type awards, oftentimes you have to get a reference and get references from people. So one of the things that can be challenging for graduate students is to write back those references about themselves. So you need to learn how to write really nice things about yourself, because you don't want to leave that all in the hands of the referee. So what people tend to find really helpful is, rather than saying, I'm applying for this, I need a reference for you by this date, here's my CV, here's my application, you figure out how to write this letter. Because believe me, faculty have a lot of letters to write and a lot of things to do. It's really helpful if you think about, look at across your referees, you say, here's one or two things that I want each of these people to highlight to make sure that everything gets covered, so that important details about what makes me a strong applicant don't get missed, and make those suggestions to them. So it's perfectly okay when you're asking for a reference to say, if you're thinking about things you might want to say about me, here's some ideas about things that I would appreciate if you highlight. Sometimes you're going to have referees who will ask you to write the letter for them, and that happened to me during my master's degree when I was at the University of Western Ontario, and one of the faculty members there, who was very senior, when we would ask her for reference letters for scholarships and fellowships, she said, okay, you write the letter and send it to me. So that is, intimidating, because you're thinking, oh my gosh, what am I going to write? And I have to write really kind of nice things about myself, which I don't know that any of us feel really great about. But it's actually a really important thing to develop for yourself. And of course, she added flourishes, but we all learned in that program how to write a good reference letter, a strong reference letter for ourselves. So if you're asked to do that, don't kind of think, gosh, that person's lazy, or, oh my gosh, how am I going to do this? Really take it to heart, write a good letter, write a strong letter about yourself. Don't hold back. Because that person will edit it if they feel like they want to edit it. So help your referees put your best foot forward. The other thing that you need to really do, and this goes back to something Merrilee said, is you have to be able to demonstrate your alignment, how your work aligns with what your supervisor is doing. So lots of times when we get feedback, even from students that have really strong applications, so reviewers look across a number of different things. They tend to look at marks, they tend to look at your CV, they tend to look at what exactly you're doing, and then they look at the fit with your supervisor. So when it's not sort of like exact puzzle pieces, and it isn't always, it's really important that in your part of the application, as well as in your supervisor's reference, it says, how can we fit together? What are we getting out of this partnership? because that doesn't leave the reviewers then to start wondering. Because when you're sitting there as a reviewer, you have a pile of 20 things, 20 applications usually. They're not assigned, unless you're applying somewhere like the Alzheimer's Society or the Heart and Stroke Foundation, where people are in that clinical area. If you review, for example, for CIHR, you just get 20. And I do reviews here at UBC internally for the Faculty of Graduate Studies, and you just get 20. Like, people are doing stuff I can't even judge their proposal sometimes because of the type of research they're doing. So you're really looking at the people in this partnership have given you adequate information to be able to say, okay, this is a good partnership and they're going to go well together. So make sure that you're giving the reviewers that information. And I guess that also goes to Merrilee's comment around, not using a lot of acronyms. If I read an application with more than 2 acronyms, I have no idea by the time I get to page 3 what their acronym is, and I don't even care. So, really be thoughtful about where an acronym is useful and where it's not useful. And because if you end up reading something that looks like a math formula, because there's so many acronyms in it, it's really hard as a reviewer to get through that because you're just flipping around trying to figure out what the person's talking about. And then the other thing, one of the other things I want to say is no amount of funding is too small. So when you see things like $500, $1,000, or there's no cash value attached, like sometimes you go to conferences and there will be a prize for best student poster, those are all really valuable things. Because when you complete sort of a CV module for an application, there's a space for previous funding or awards. And if that's empty, it's really hard for the reviewer because, again, you may have great marks, you may have a great proposal, you may have a great supervisor, but you're in a competition with all of the other people. There's going to be a group there that has all those things that are great, plus they have some awards listed. And if you have that blank, then that is something then when they're judging 2 things next to each other, they're going to say, well, that person has already demonstrated some trajectory of raising funds. So I think that's a really important piece to consider, that there is no amount that's too small. The travel awards from CIHR and from the Faculty of Graduate Studies here at UBC are really valuable because that's an award, it's competitive, and you put it on your CV. And one of the postdocs that's working with me right now just got one from CIHR to go present in the UK. So they're very helpful, and they show that you're building this trajectory around funding. The point around reviewer criteria that Merrilee showed, oftentimes when you're doing a grant, so reviewers are going to use that as their criteria. So one of the things is you never want a reviewer to have to look for information. So if, as Merrilee showed, they're looking at your background, they're looking at your methods, they're looking at your KT plan, those are your subheadings. And you use the language that's used in the reviewer criteria so that those reviewers say, does this study have a clear purpose? There's your subheading and purpose. So you're creating a proposal or an application that is mirroring those reviewer criteria. Because again, reviewers have a stack of applications. They don't necessarily like to search for information. So sometimes you'll get feedback. Like I'll get feedback on a grant and somebody else, as part of the review, will be like, you didn't talk about X, because that's part of the reviewer criteria. And you think, well, it's right there. Why didn't you see it? But I haven't given them those flags, as a writer, and in order for them to find those key things. So it's really important to make sure you do that. The slide about attention to detail, I cannot emphasize enough. And one of the reasons sometimes there is this disjunction between, there isn't a good flow in the application is because sometimes you have a drawer full of applications and you're cutting and pasting, and we all do that. But it's really important to give yourself enough time. So I actually have an annual schedule, and if my grant is not done pretty much polished 2 weeks before, then my ulcer will start to bleed because you need that time to go back. Because the other part that will drive you crazy is you can find typos every time. That's why you get other people to read your work. But you really, like, typos and grammatical errors are okay as long as that congruence is there. But when you lack the congruence, it's, again, you're kind of in a stack of applications, and the reviewer might have an application there that has good congruence. So you really want to be paying attention to those details and giving yourself enough time so you can go back again and again and again. The last thing I just wanted to comment on is, because we're in the discipline of nursing, many of us have not what we call a traditional trajectory. So when you think about people in other disciplines, perhaps the basic sciences or even some of the humanities, they graduate from high school, did an undergraduate degree, so then they're 21. They do a master's, or they may have accelerated through their master's degree. So they could potentially have their PhD finished by the age of 25 or 26. And they may have spent that entire time living, on student stipends and are kind of working on those publications. And so they have a different kind of a profile necessarily than as nurses. Some of us have worked for decades before coming to graduate school. And we don't always recognize and identify the wonderful things we've done as things that can go on our CV to celebrate our wonderfulness. So it's really important because reviewers are impressed when, as clinicians, we put in applications, we can talk about work we've done, programs that we have developed in practice, and they might be located at one place, or they may have spread to other locations, policies we may have developed that have been taken up in other places, particularly now as knowledge translation becomes a much bigger component of research funding. So I also think, don't sell yourself short, because we have very non-traditional trajectories, career trajectories that get us to graduate school. It's really thinking about, how do I profile this in a way that it shows up really nicely in my application as a fairly significant thing. And so, I will read applications from students that are from other disciplines where they may have, volunteered and helped organize a food drive once. And then you can have nurses who have worked for 20 or 30 years who have, moved mountains basically in comparison, and that's not evident on their application. There will just be a place under employment that says 1996 to 2006 I worked at this place. And you haven't given me anything, and like reviewers want to score people highly, but you haven't given me anything. So I'm like, that's a black hole. That was 20 years. I have no idea what you did. So thinking about, were there committees that you were on that were particularly high profile, or, those kinds of things. And you don't want to fill your CV with stuff. So there's also the issue of CV padding, and this is why you talk to people about how your CV looks and how you profile things. But you want to be able to pull out 4 or 5 really great things to highlight, to say, these are things I did. I organized a community workshop, and 200 people attended, and we had a minister there, we had policymakers there. Like, just think about the things you've done and don't sell yourself short. Because increasingly, that KT portion, community activities portion of the application is taking on more of an emphasis when you're reviewing than, being the 10th author on a paper. So really work with your supervisors, with Merrilee or myself, around thinking about how to do that, because it's a really good thing. I guess I do have one last thing, sorry. When Merrilee shows that list of all of those different funding opportunities that Grad Studies keeps a listing of, it is worth your time. When I went to graduate school, that was in a book. You have to go to Brock Hall, you have to flip through the book. I would probably still prefer it to be that way. But there are a lot of little bursaries and scholarships that nobody ever applies for, and the money sits there. So if you qualify for one that's like $1,000, $2,000, $750, it's worth the application time if the application isn't overly onerous, because some of those things on that list people are not necessarily applying for because they don't qualify. So if you somehow fit in that, that's really, really good. The other place, last thing I'll say, that there is increase, so when Merrilee talked about MyCaps and the matching funds, there are something in Canada called National Centres for Excellence. And so one is the Canadian Frailty Network. There's another one for atrial fibrillation. And this is where you're thinking about your specialty areas. Some of them will have, they now have doctoral awards that with matching funds you can apply for. So those are good sources that we haven't really tapped into in the past very much. But I think we're happy to work with students around that because the matching funds cannot come from one of the national funding bodies. So it's a little bit complex, but if you identify one of those, to start to talk to me or whoever the PhD program coordinator is about the potential to get those matching funds somehow, then we can really strategize and think if that's going to be a possibility. Because I think those are great sources of funding that we have not necessarily used to our greatest benefit. But in the past, Jen Gibson has got one. She's getting close to the end of her program now, and Mariko Sakamoto just got one this year from the Clinical Frailty Network. So definitely worthwhile because again, as Merrilee said, some of those are not overly competitive. So their success rates are quite high compared to something like CIHR, which might be like 10% success rate. Okay, that's all my reflections.
Excellent reflections.